Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 10 of Deep Dive MH370, the investigative podcast where we break down for you step by step what happened to the missing plane and what it all might mean. In today's episode, we tackle a controversial idea that MH370 wasn't a pilot suicide, as we discussed in the last episode, but rather could have been cyber hijacked by one of the passengers aboard the plane. This is a remix of an episode that Andy Tarnoff and I did for season 1 of Deep Dive MH370, released on November 16th, 2023. In season 2, Finding MH370, I continue the investigation with a focus on what we can do to finally solve the case. You can find that here. As always, if you like the show, please hit subscribe. And for more information and a free newsletter, check out our show page at findingmh370.com. And now let's get on with the show. What we're going to be talking about today is something that is considered very controversial, even makes some people angry. So I want to really emphasize we're talking about an interpretation of events. We're not claiming that this is necessarily true, but it's a possibility that we're gonna talk about. And so people just have to listen along and judge for yourself. There are aspects of this case that are very mysterious, and we're going to have to just talk about them.
The reason we're calling this episode The Vulnerability is because we're asking ourselves if there was a vulnerability that could have been exploited to answer some of these previously unexplainable questions. When nothing else seems to make sense, you look at something else. Back in episode 7, we talked about how BFO data worked. It showed that the plane went south, but you made an apology, but something didn't sit right with you.
I initially, of course, had gone out on a limb and said, it seems to me like the plane went north. And that turned out to be wrong. The BFO data unequivocally said that the plane went south. Okay, the math is a little bit complicated. I think we walked listeners through it on an earlier episode. But once you understand how the math works, it's very unequivocal. The plane, in order to have created the data that it sent back to Inmarsat, it must have been traveling to the south. And so once I realized that, I said, okay, this is what it means. I was wrong to think that it went south. But as the story continued to unfold, strange revelations occurred, which taken together raised new questions. Now, once again, with the touchstone that I'll keep coming back to with MH370 is that this is a deeply strange case. Again and again, things happen that it's very difficult to explain, and that either were a result of an incredible coincidence or string of coincidences, or someone or something did something very odd, very unusual. Now, remember, this is a case that nothing like this has ever happened before.
I mean, it's all weird, right? It's all mysterious, but the fact that the SDU had been turned off and then turned back on again, that is something that investigators believe, like that one is not so much in question, insofar as nothing is not in question, but short of UFOs. But that is the thing that is super duper weird.
We didn't find out about it until a couple months after the plane disappeared, when the authorities released a report that mentioned that the only really plausible way to explain the pattern of signals that had been received was that somebody had powered it off somehow. This box had been powered down and then powered back up again. It remains highly contentious to this day, highly contentious, as to how this could have happened, whether it's something that a pilot would do or that very few pilots would know how to do or be motivated to do. There's something really weird about this. But you talk to pilots, and a lot of pilots cannot really explain how this happens. Okay, let's talk about a bunch of things happening, which together made me wonder if there was something else very different happening about this case. Number one, the SDU getting rebooted.
So first of all, your former colleagues in the independent group, they said there's a simple answer to this. They said that they wanted to make sure that nobody from the cabin or the passengers could use the satphone to call for help. But that would have done the trick, right? But that's not the only way, and that's not the easy way. That's not like the way you turn off the phones.
Well, people have come up with various explanations for why somebody might have wanted to reboot the SDU, and I think we talked about this in an earlier episode. One of them is that somebody wanted to save power from the engine, so turned off the entire electrical system. Another more recently mooted idea was that somebody wanted to prevent someone from using the satcom. That there's a handset in the cabin, and so they turned off half the electrical system in order to prevent that from happening. But there's simpler ways to disable the
okay.
the phone
But
system.
nonetheless,
So I
that
don't
was
think
the first thing that you're like, that's a weird thing.
when that information was released, it told us that we had made a wrong assumption, because everybody had assumed that this system had just inadvertently been left on. Okay, so now that what would have been a very simple to understand explanation suddenly becomes hard to understand. This is another case of MH370 upsetting expectations and violating expectations. Okay, but that wasn't the only thing. Then some other things happened as well that seemed odd. One was a revelation that it turns out that in a 777, that all of the electronics that run the airplane, that run the flight controls, that run the communications, everything is inside a compartment that is accessible from the cabin. All right, so you can pull back a carpet, and go down into this.
At the time of MH370's flight, one could literally go into the first class passenger section, pull up a piece of carpet, and crawl down into the belly of the plane.
It's true. And shortly before the plane disappeared, actually, an airline pilot had written a paper explaining that this vulnerability existed, and he worried that it could be exploited, that somebody with nefarious intent could get down into the electronics bay and have in front of them all of the boxes, all of the computers that do everything on a plane. And so he was already worried. He was trying to sound the alarm that it's possible to get in. Okay, but that doesn't really directly relate to the issue that the box had been rebooted. But it was just a fact that had become floating around. And then another piece of the puzzle was Mike Exner explained to me. So everything hinges on this BFO data. How does this BFO data get generated? We talked about that in a previous episode. But where does the SDU get the data that it uses to make the calculation? Yeah. It needs to know where it is and how the plane is moving relative to the satellite to do this Doppler precompensation, to change the frequency.
Yes.
How does it know where it is and how fast it's moving? And Mike Exner, one of the independent group members, explained to me, and information comes from the electronics bay. It comes from a box called the IRS, the Inertial Reference System. And this is a system that combines information from GPS and inertial guidance systems. And it basically, it's the plane's idea of where it is and how it's moving.
Just to clarify, anyone who knew where it was could pull up that carpet and walk down the stairs. They'd probably get in trouble, but you could do it.
Exactly. And so as mid-2014 rolls around, the authorities are getting ready to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in this very ambitious and sophisticated search of the Southern Ocean. They're going to go to this remote patch, which is 3 miles deep, and there's like mountains down there and crevices and stuff. And they're going to scan using sonar the pretty huge area of seabed in order to find the plane. And so as they're getting ready to do that, the question I'm asking myself is there any other possible way? And let me emphasize and put in italics the word possible. Is there any conceivable way that this data could have been generated other than what the authorities are assuming? Okay? And now, because of these pieces of information that have been floating around separately, put them all together, and what do you get? You have a situation in which anybody could theoretically access the electronics bay where the box is that generates the position and navigational information that gets sent to the SDU that it uses to perform the calculation.
So what's happening here is we're talking about fly-by-wire, and it's not that different than the concept of drive-by-wire.
Right. When I ride my bicycle, when I turn my handlebars on my bicycle, I'm actually moving a piece of metal that's directly connected to the wheel, and that makes the whole bike turn. And cars used to be made like that. My car probably still is. But I went flying, was it yesterday, the day before, and I was in a Cherokee, Piper Cherokee from like probably the 70s. And yeah, when I pull back on the controls, it's connected to a cable that's physically connected to the tail. And so you have a direct mechanical linkage. The 777 was the first plane that Boeing built that was completely fly-by-wire. It was an all-electric plane. So when you move the controls in the 777, you're actually sending a electric signal to a computer that is then interpreting what you want and then translating it into signals that get sent to an actuator that moves the control surfaces. If you're in the electronics bay of the 777, you have total control of that airplane. Everything that happens from that plane comes out of electronics bay.
There was a statement by Mike Exner that said, "Yeah, that can't be done," and then he left it at that. So,
the gist of what we're saying in episode 10 right now is that there appears to have been a vulnerability or a backdoor, depending on what you want to call it. There was a vulnerability by which it's possible. Now, whether or not it was taken advantage of or not is a separate issue. But what we're asking in this episode is, was there a vulnerability by which it becomes less than 100% certain that the BFO data that indicates that the plane went into the southern Indian Ocean was correct, was not in fact tampered with? So, is it impossible? No.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's not likely. It's never been done before. But we're just putting out the theory here that we don't know if such a vulnerability exists. It may not.
But is it possible that it exists? Now, there's ways to say, no, it can't exist because X. Because there's a whole chain of things that has to be true in order for this idea to work.
A ton of things.
Like if this was a 767, an older generation of Boeing, this idea wouldn't work because you cannot take over a 767 just by taking over the electronics bay, because there are mechanical linkages that a person in the cockpit can do that you can't do anything about in the electronics bay. In an Airbus, the hatch into the electronics bay is in the cockpit.
That makes sense to me.
So only the flight crew can get into it. Okay. So it couldn't be this wouldn't work with an Airbus. It wouldn't work with any plane older than a 777. It wouldn't work with a 757, a 747, a 767. It wouldn't have worked with any with any airline that was paying for the full priced version of Inmarsat.
Because the classic Aero system was the one that wouldn't have generated or allowed the mathematicians at Inmarsat to generate these ping rings and figure this information out. They would have just simply had the information where it went, how it went, what.
Right.
But it didn't.
And also remember, we have also talked about how it has to be a box from Thales and not Rockwell.
Yes.
Because of the way that the pre-compensation works.
So again, the aging satellite with the wobbliness and it's like a lot of things are lining up.
Also, the mathematicians, so this is another thing. This whole idea that somebody might have accessed this box. There's a way that you could, because of this existence of this backdoor, this vulnerability, there is a way that if you were super sophisticated and nefarious and clever and aggressive, you could take this plane and alter the BFO data to make it look like the plane was going south when it was really going north. The question is whether somebody could have made a false trail of electronic breadcrumbs to mislead investigators, right? But this idea would only work if there was a whole daisy chain of things about this flight. But it turns out that all of those things are true. And so if we're proposing that it's possible to take planes of a certain kind and create this false trail, it's very rare. Maybe this is the only flight in the world that passes all of these requirements. There's one more requirement I just want to throw in there, because this method only discriminates northern routes and southern moving routes. It doesn't discriminate east-west routes. Some people even now speculate that this plane was being hijacked to like Mecca or something, as some kind of an Islamist plot. This data couldn't discriminate east-west like that. Okay. This particular vulnerability we're proposing is a very, very specific. We're not, because there's people who have come forward and say, oh, the Americans don't like China, so they shot it down. Or, maybe somebody was maybe it wasn't mangosteens in the cargo hold. Maybe it was gold and they wanted to steal it. Those kind of very vague ideas about, nefarious intent and hijacking, they're very vague. And so if people who dismiss them as conspiracy theorists have something to say, because it's just a very vague notion. We're making a very, very specific observation here. And we're not saying it necessarily happened, but we're saying it appears that this whole chain of seeming coincidences add up to a particular vulnerability that only this plane had, and that it could have allowed someone to do this thing that we're proposing that makes people mad.
All right, Jeff, I am not even going to let us go there yet, because now you're starting to talk about things that we haven't even introduced to the audience yet. And I don't think we're at the spot yet where we talk about the likelihood of this until we talk about the theory and concept of hacking. And this is where I'm going to nerd out just a little bit. And we may devote an entire episode to this, but I want to talk a little bit about what this means, how people are familiar with it, what people think is preposterous, and things that have actually happened that people think are preposterous, and what's possible and what isn't. Because if you don't buy into or accept that stuff, then what you're talking about right now is unfathomable. Yet hacking is not a new concept. It's been happening for a long time. I did a little bit of research on this. In World War II, we had the Enigma machine. That is definitely not the kind of hacking that we're talking about. But I mean, it changed the course of World War II.
But it's a kind of hacking in the same sense that, like, somebody figured out how a system worked so that they could subvert it.
Exactly. So there are a bunch of other examples, high-tech, low-tech ones. There's the Fancy Bear DNC hack in the Clinton, the Trump race.
Right.
Some of this stuff is as simple as phishing or brute force, all sorts of stuff. And I'm wondering if you remember in 2015, the San Bernardino workplace shooting. Remember that happening?
Right. I do.
So that was a guy whose name was Saeed Rizwan, and I think he killed 14 people, and the FBI wanted his iPhone. And the FBI wanted to see what was going on, and his phone was locked. But Apple said very, very loudly and clearly that their phones were unhackable. And the FBI said, tough, right. Do it anyway.
This is the modern equivalent of the Enigma machine.
Yeah, like
state of the art, most modern encryption.
Apple said not only can it not be hacked by you, it can't be hacked by us. So, they're trying to get this court order, the FBI is, and Apple's pushing back as they do. That's their line. All phones can be hacked except for the iPhone. Well, so the FBI goes to this Australian company called Azimuth Security, and they say, hack it for us. And they get two guys for $900,000, and they find this exploit through the Mozilla browser, and using the Lightning port on the iPhone, they basically apply two more exploits, and then they have control over the phone, and they crack it.
Which was believed impossible.
It was believed impossible. FBI says, okay, good, we've got what we need, thanks.
Because it's so lucrative. If you can find an exploit, if people will pay you good money to do the impossible.
Yeah.
Basically.
So they called it Condor, and it's.
They called the exploit.
Yeah.
Condor.
And there are all sorts of different kinds
Operation
of
Condor.
There are all sorts of different kinds of hacking things. This one I would consider a 0-day exploit, which basically means getting into software or hardware before the developers realize that it's hackable. It's a window of vulnerability.
0-day means how many days have elapsed between the developer being aware of a vulnerability and the hacker taking advantage of it. In this case, it's 0 days because you find out about it because it's happened.
So Apple fixed this as soon as they found out about this.
So people who say this system is unhackable, Apple found out about it, the Germans found out about it during World War II. Your assumptions about the safety of your system might be wrong. Your opponents might be more clever than you, or might be more resourceful than you think.
They're white hat hackers. Those are like the good guys who look around for exploits, and then they find them, and then they tell the good guys. And then there are black hat ones. We know about. We know Russia's totally into this. So it's whether you believe in election interference in the United States or not, the Russians have an interest in this kind of stuff, and so does the United States. They have a cyber weapon. It was a worm, and it may still be in service basically, but it was a joint developed, and they've like kind of admitted it, and they kind of haven't. But it took these Iranian nuclear facilities offline. Like there's all sorts of different kind of hacking things out there, and I just find it really naive for anyone to say, sorry, it can't be done.
Well, and also remember, too, I think it's important to realize that not all hacking involves computer systems. There was a great documentary made about how the Russians managed to tamper with the urine collection bottles that the anti-doping agency used to try to keep athletics pure from doping. And the Swiss company had made these bottles that, once you screwed on the top, you couldn't remove it. There was just no way. It was impossible. And yet the Russians figured out how to do it so they could continue doping their athletes. An important point, that I really want to draw a line under in this episode is that the existence of this vulnerability is not an idea that is mine alone, and it's not an idea that I developed alone. And one of the key architects of this idea is Victor Iannello, a member of the independent group, who has been very critical of me on Twitter and so forth. That's fine. He's allowed to disagree with me. But he wrote a paper explaining, actually carrying the ideas further than anyone else ever has. He had the insight that just by changing a single parameter in the satellite data unit, you could make the plane look like it was going south when it was really going north. I hasten to add that Victor does not think that this vulnerability was exploited.
It's true. So he said that, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that's all I can do here. He said that it's possible, but he doesn't think it happened? Is that what you're telling me?
No, he says that there's a 0% chance that it was exploited. I really want to give all listeners and viewers a comprehensive understanding of the evidence in this case and what it means. But what we're introducing in this episode is an alternate lens through which all of the evidence of this case can be looked at. So things that are very coincidental, if you assume that the pilot took it without having any idea about Inmarsat data, then the turning on of the SDU, for instance, is kind of baffling and kind of hard to explain and just sort of a mystery that you have to live with. But if you imagine that there was an exploit, then the turning on of the SDU makes a lot of sense because it's just somebody who went in, turned the box off, changed the parameters, and turned it back on again. And there's a lot of other things that, as evidence that will emerge that we'll look at in the future, that make one kind of sense one way and a different kind of sense the other way.
Right. So this was almost like a preface to something that we're going to talk about more. But the reason we're doing it this way is so we can explain why vulnerabilities are not a batshit crazy idea, and then we will get into what those vulnerabilities are. You teased it a little bit. There's a whole lot more data, and there's a whole lot more specific detail that we can talk about that starts to reinforce why you think that this was a possibility. But I think that's another episode.
It's interesting, Andy, that when Inmarsat first started looking at the data that they had, they wondered, is somebody pranking us? Has somebody tampered with this evidence? And I asked them why they put that idea aside. And they basically said, well, because we did our analysis and the analysis gave us a clear answer. And so they basically didn't think that anybody was sophisticated enough to pull off an attack that would leave behind data that left a clear picture.
I don't know. A whole bunch of people could kind of pull off that level of sophistication, but I just refuse to accept that nobody could do it, and believing that nobody could do it is the reason that nobody did it.
That's a great point. And when I first started thinking about this idea, I thought, wow, you would have to be almost superhumanly clever to do this. But as the years went by and I did more reading and more research, and I started to write about the field of electronic warfare, which is a very active field, and like lots of really interesting things are happening with drones, and they're hacking into drones to shoot them down or take them over. But there's this entire industry called electronic warfare, which has to do with messing with other people's systems and other people's signals in a way that confuses them. And it's a very bread and butter approach to alter Doppler signals. If you're flying into someone's territory and their radar is bouncing off of you, you can measure that incoming radar and retransmit it at a different frequency to make it seem like you aren't there or that you're traveling at impossible
Well, I guess
speeds.
you just gave us material for another episode.
The point of this podcast is to explain to people an idea that is a little bit complicated. Well, it's complicated enough that the Australians who are looking for this plane don't even understand it.
It's very complicated.
But the gist of this idea is that it's not 100% certain that this data wasn't tampered with. We know of a way that it's physically possible for it to be tampered with. So whatever value you want to assign to that possibility, it's not zero.
Well, that's why we're doing this.
Okay, that's all we have for you today. In the next episode of Season 1, Deep Dive MH370, we'll be looking at the possible routes that the plane might have taken based on the Inmarsat data. Until then, if you'd like to sign up for a free newsletter, you can do that at our show page, deepdivemh370.com. And for now, this is Jeff Wise saying, don't stop looking and don't stop asking hard questions. See you next time.